Once again, we look at the situation that is confronting Israel at this present time. Last Shabbat, we looked at the words of Daniel in chapter 8, where we saw how, if 2,300 evenings and mornings were considered as years, and counting from Alexander the Great, it pointed forward to the Six-Day War of 1967. Then, in the same way, by looking at chapter 12, we also saw how the fulfillment of 1,290 days plus 1,335, when viewed as years, starting with the count of at the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in 607 BCE, that brought us to 2017 CE, as being, of course, the end of 6,000 years of human development history. Those are the two very significant years, as not only do they both fall within our lifetime, but more importantly, the former marked a stage in history which saw the fulfillment of the words of Yeshua when he spoke in Luke chapter 21 verse 24. There he was saying, or telling, when the time of the Goyim that had domination over Jerusalem or Jerusalem would come to an end. Then the Six-Day War brought Jerusalem back under the control of Israel, along with the greater portion of the territory that Yahweh had promised to Abraham, that would be the inheritance of his descendants through Yaakov, or Jacob, his grandson. That same war also greatly increased the belligerence of the PA, or the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, which, having been formed earlier, came under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, who claimed that he was acting on behalf of the Palestinian Arabs, claiming sole rights for the land as descendants of Esau, firstborn twin brother of Yaakov. At the same time, many nations under the umbrella of both Christianity and Islam, through the United Nations, demanded that the territories gained by Israel be handed back so that the Palestinians would have a chance of land for peace. And the exchange was designed to bring about the two-state solution, based on what had failed to occur under the United Nations Resolution 181 of November 1947. Then, in 1967, following the war, new demands were actually laid by the UN with contemptuous disregard for the fact that their earlier Resolution 181 had actually failed to be ratified. The reason was because, quoting from the Oxford Bibliography Online, we see that in 1947, the United Kingdom and the United Nations Special Committee for Palestine concluded that the Palestinian Arabs and Jews who had been subject to the British administration under the League of Nations mandate from 1922 were sufficiently advanced to govern themselves. The UN Assembly, in Resolution 181, version 2, for the future government of Palestine, which made the provision for the establishment of two states in the territory, along with a special international regime for the city of Jerusalem. The plan was never implemented in the way that was foreseen due to the outbreak of the war, although the United Nations Secretariat, the Soviet Union, and the Jewish Agency considered it a binding act of international law. End of quote. It seems perfectly clear from the gains of Israel that what they made in just 6 days in 1967 was the result of Yahweh's intervention in the war. Attempts of 5 neighboring Arab nations to overpower Israel and bring about the desires of the UN had been thwarted by Yahweh. But in the next 50 years, or 1 year vel, from 1967 to 2017, saw successive governments in Israel give considerable portions of the promised territory back into the hands of the PA. Yet, with every offer of land on the altar of ecumenical unity, met with increased terrorism and street violence. Even now, in 2024, we are yet another 7 years or one full Shemitah cycle further on from 2017. And the latter situation has worsened to the point of potential eradication of the whole state of Israel. Will Yahweh allow his people to be wiped out as a nation? At now or at any time in the future? The possibility is unthinkable. So once again, it is time to dig deep into both Daniel and Revelation and see how the words of prophecy speaks about this present world situation. So what I said last week in my Devar was, and applies again today, that what I am about to say and share with you is my personal understanding, based on what I have firmly believed Yeshua had revealed through the scriptures and through the voice of the Ruach, the Holy Spirit. Having spent many years studying the relationship between the books of Daniel and Revelation, I'm slowly receiving a clearer picture as the situation in this age begins to unfold. So please bear with me, because I think it is important to unpack the various parts of both Daniel and Revelation in light of what is happening right now in the world today. Again, I will let you be the judge of whether what I'm saying is valid or not. As I said last Shabbat, I believe that there were two Daniels. The first was the prophet who had been taken captive from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar at the time of the destruction of the first temple in 607 BCE. The second Daniel appears to have been a Cohen, or priest, who lived most of his life in Shushan, the capital of Persia. His visions were mainly confined to the chronological events that were leading to the time of the death of Yeshua and the destruction of the second temple. However, Daniel the prophet was given visions about not only the ancient nations between the time of Babylon right through to Rome, but also the visions that led forward to this modern era. So firstly, I want to look back at the earlier vision given to the one we call Daniel the prophet, where we find him being told in Daniel Chapter 2 verse 1, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar became troubled by a series of dreams which he had, and he could not sleep. Finally, after many attempts, he called upon Daniel, whom Yahweh had given the dream and also the interpretation. As it says in verse 19, then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision at night, and Daniel blessed Yahweh, the God of heaven. Then in verses 27-28, Daniel said, there is a God in heaven who unlocks mysteries, and he has revealed to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the Acharet Hayumim. Here are your dream and the visions you had in your head when you were in your bed. The interpretation given by Daniel, as is told in verse 27, was to occur in the Acharet Hayumim, which means the end of this age. So what Daniel was revealing to King Nebuchadnezzar was a foreshadow of what will soon be fulfilled in the 21st century. Daniel revealed the dream in verses 31 through 35, as we read earlier. Your Majesty had a dream of a vision of a statue, very large and extremely bright. It stood in front of you, and its appearance was terrifying. The head of the statue was fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its trunk and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly iron and partly clay. As you watched, a stone separated itself without any human hand, struck the statue on its feet, and the feet of iron and clay, and broke them into pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken into pieces, which became like chaff on the threshing floor in the summer. The wind blew them away without leaving any trace. But the stone which had struck the statue grew into a huge mountain that filled the whole earth. We see that it was all pointing toward the era in which we are now living. Starting with the structure of the statue itself, we see Daniel mentions 4 types of metal in descending order of value: gold, silver, bronze, and iron. Then finally, a totally strange alloy of iron and clay, which in the real world is an physical impossibility. But in the context of the vision, it makes perfect sense. Then, when we turn to verses 36 to 43, Daniel unpacks the significance of the metals as they relate to empires that were to follow from the time that he was given the vision. The gold, of course, was Babylon. The silver was Medo-Persia. The bronze was Greece. And the iron was Rome. As we see in verse 40, the 4th kingdom will be as strong as iron. Iron can break anything into pieces, pulverize it, and crush it. Just as the iron crushes anything, this kingdom will break other kingdoms into pieces and crush them. The Roman Empire itself is interesting because it not only breaks the empires before it, but it also shattered itself into what is now known as the nations of Western Europe, who in turn colonialized many parts of the world. However, before Rome shattered, it also became divided into 2 legs of the statue, with 2 separate capitals: Rome in the west and Constantinople in the east, with Rome going into decline around 476 CE. But Constantinople, which was more commonly known at that time as the Byzantine Empire, survived as an empire until around 1453 CE. However, the western or right foot, which had been centered on Rome, has never died out, but instead morphed into what became the Holy Roman Empire of Germany. It was what can be defined as a polity, or a group of people with a collective identity who are organized by some form of political, institutionalized social relations and have a capacity to mobilize resources, all of which are now, of course, represented in modern times as the European Union. Concurrently with the development of the Holy Roman Empire, which is the right foot of the statue, the left foot also morphed into what became the Ottoman Empire, which dominated the eastern Mediterranean region from 1517 right through until it was conquered by the Allied forces in World War I. So we see the feet and the toes of the statue are profoundly important in our quest to understand the place of the various nations which now exist, because the statue showed that it all applied to the Acharet HaYomim, the end of this age. So looking at the last part of the statue, Daniel said in verses 42 to 43, just as the toes of the feet were part iron and part clay, the kingdoms will be partly strong and partly brittle. You saw the iron mixed with clay. That means that they will cement their alliances by intermarriages, but they won't stick together any more than iron blends with clay. People intermarry, but nations form alliances. So what we're seeing with the 10 toes is an alliance between the iron nations and the clay nations. So what, in relation to today's situation, can all this mean? If we now turn our attention again to Revelation chapter 17, we see how Yeshua completed the picture that had been given to Daniel by telling Yochanan, or John, in chapter 17 verse 12, the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings that have not yet begun to rule, and they will receive power as kings for 1 hour, along with the beast. Now, what national alliances in today's world could be considered as the 10 kings in this verse? I believe the answer lies in what was created by the joint carve-up of the Arab world in the 1920s. The Allied forces of Britain and France together conquered the Ottoman Empire and divided the territory that had once loosely been called the Arab League. Began in the early 1920s and resulted in the creation of 10 separate small Arab nations, rather than a reconstituted Arab League. So the question must be asked, who are those 10 Arab nations? If we look at the map of the Middle East, we see that the whole territory which Yahweh promised originally to Abraham in Bereshit, Genesis chapter 15 verse 18, he said, I have given this land to your descendants from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. That whole territory in that covenant included the land of Canaan, which is now known, of course, as Eretz Israel. But later, in Bereshit, chapter 17, verses 7 and 8, Yahweh qualified that first covenant, didn't cancel it, but qualified it by making a second covenant with Abraham. The second covenant was more specific in that it defined the territory that was promised to the descendants of Yitzhak, Isaac. In that latter covenant, Yahweh said, I am establishing my covenant between me and you, speaking to Abraham, along with your descendants after you, generation after generation, as an everlasting covenant to God for you and your descendants after you. I will give you and your descendants after you the land which you are now foreigners, all the land of Canaan, as a permanent possession, and I will be their God. That covenant was made between Yahweh and Abraham, but excluded the descendants of Ishmael. However, a promise was also made regarding the descendants of Ishmael, where in Bereshit 17:20-21, Yahweh said of them, As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I have blessed him. I will make him fruitful and give him many descendants. He will be the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Yitzhak, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year. So the significant difference between those two covenants made with Abraham is that the territory west of the Yarden River was promised exclusively to the descendants of Yitzhak, while the rest of the territory east of the Yarden became the rightful territory of the descendants of Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son. That was rather a long way to get back to looking at the 10 kings which we see in Revelation chapter 17 verse 12. So let's recap. The 10 kings, the 10 horns Yochanan saw, they were 10 kings that have not yet begun to rule, but they received power as kings for 1 hour along with the beast. So when the verse says they have not yet begun to rule, we must ask, what period is Yochanan referring to? Was Yochanan referring to the time when he received the vision in 95 CE? Or was he referring to this modern era now? In answering that question, we need to go back to the introduction of Revelation. As we read, where Yochanan was told in chapter 1, verse 1, we see this is the revelation which God gave to Yeshua, the Messiah, so that he could show his servants what must happen very soon. He communicated it by sending his angel to the servant Yochanan. Then in 1 verse 10, Yochanan said, I came to be in the Spirit on the day of the Lord, and I heard behind me a voice like a trumpet. All that is similar to what we also read in Revelation chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. That, I believe, gives us the answer we need. Yochanan was speaking in the same way as most of the prophets had spoken, in the ways that they had been given by Yahweh. So, the day of the Lord appears to be referring to that 7th millennium, or the Shabbat of human development, which, if I understand the scriptural chronology accurately, began in 2017, which also was the end date of Daniel's final vision. Remember, when you added 1290 years to 1335 years from the destruction of the first temple until the end of that vision, it brought us to 2017. So if the understanding is correct, then the 10 kings Yochanan saw were a recent phenomenon. Therefore, when we come back to the narrative in Revelation chapter 17, we can start to put the pieces of the jigsaw together. Beginning in verse 7, Yochanan says, the angel said to me, I will tell you the hidden meaning of the woman and the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. Then in verse 8, things get complicated. When the angel says to Yochanan, the beast whom you saw once was, now is not, and will come up from the abyss, but is going off to destruction. So let's try and unpack that little lot. What the angel is saying in that verse, firstly, is that the beast once was. So during the era when Yochanan was seeing the vision, it says that the beast was not. Yet, at some unspecified time in the future, it comes up out of the abyss. This truly is a mind bender. So I'll try and explain it as simply as possible, but you may need to go over it a number of times to get a clearer understanding of what I believe is being said. So going back to chapter 17, verses 1 to 6, we see the angel describing the woman about whom he says she was Baal, the great mother of whores and of all earth's obscenities. Then in verse 7 he explains that she was the one riding the beast. So was the beast carrying the woman in 95 CE when he received that vision? I don't think so, because as the introduction to Revelation, verses 1:1 and 4:1 to 3, both suggest that he was seeing the vision in the Lord's day, which is most likely, if we understand it correctly, the 1,000 years of Yeshua's reign of redemption. So according to chapter 11, verse 7, we see 2 witnesses had finished witnessing for 1,260 days. Then the beast comes up out of the abyss, fights against them, and finally kills them. Therefore, the encounter between the woman and the beast must have taken place before the beast goes into the abyss. And it must be before Yeshua begins his 1,000-year reign. But it could not occur at the time of 95 CE when Yochanan received the vision. Because in chapter 17 verse 11 it says that the beast which you once saw now is not, is an eighth king, and it comes from the seven. So, as it's the eighth king coming from the seven, we need to determine who those seven kings were that preceded the beast. Yochanan does not name them. But when we compare those words with the similar words in the vision to Daniel, the prophet, we find a trail of 7 empires have actually dominated Israel. Then Yochanan says in 17 verses 9 through 10, this calls for a mind of wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman is sitting. Also, they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is living now, and the other is yet to come. And when he does come, he will remain only a little while. Now 5 kings, although not mentioned by name, appear to be 1, Egypt, 2, Ashur, 3, Babylon, 4, Medo-Persia, 5, Greece, and then we come to the 6th one. Those 5 had already fallen when Yochanan received that vision in 95 CE. But remember, he was seeing all these events that were occurring as being future. So when he says now is now living, he must be referring to Rome, that 6th one, because Rome was dominating Israel in 95 CE. If Rome was the 6th king, there was still one more to follow. And the only empire that has actually dominated Jerusalem and Israel after the Roman Empire, of course, was the Ottoman Empire, which appears to be the 7th king. It only lasted 400 years, which by comparison with the former empires is a relatively short period. Then, as we saw in verse 11, the 8th king, the beast, comes out from the 7. So, as the Ottoman Empire was conquered by the Allied forces in World War I, after that, no empire arose. Instead, the League of Nations was formed, which, in conjunction with the British and French carve-up of the territories of the former Arab League, took place during the 1920s. Then following World War II, the League of Nations itself morphed into what is now the United Nations, which Resolution 181 paved the way for the modern state of Israel. Now, that has been a rather exhausting journey to get to the point of establishing who those 10 kings really are, and when they may actually begin to rule. As Yochanan says in verse 12 of chapter 17, the 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet begun to rule, but they receive power as kings for 1 hour along with the beast. So finally the question can be considered. Who are those 10 kings? If they are all modern kings, they have to be the Arab nations that were formed after World War I. So looking at the carve-up of the Arab League by the British and French forces, we see that the 10 new nations that were created, which when seen in relationship to Israel, and moving clockwise from the location of Israel itself, starting at Israel's northern boundary, we see them as 1, Lebanon, 2, Syria, 3, Iraq, 4, Kuwait, 5, Bahrain, 6 Qatar, 7 United Arab Emirates, 8 Yemen, 9 Saudi Arabia, and 10 the Kingdom of Jordan. Those are the modern Arab nations that were established under that carve-up at the hands of the British and French governments. The only Gulf state that has stood apart from the rest of the Arab nations is Oman, which remained a separate kingdom in its own right for centuries. It did not become part of the Ottoman Empire. However, as we can see, because of the ideological division between the Sunnis and the Shiite Muslims, there is likely to be, in the not too distant future, a break away from the Shiite domination of Iran, with the 10 kings joining forces to turn against Israel as a collective body. So the saga continues, with the pressure mounting with every passing day for Israel to surrender to the whims of the Western world and agree to a two-state solution. That has never been ratified. Why? Because the Palestinian Authority would never agree to it. So next Shabbat, I want to conclude this analysis of the Middle Eastern situation by looking more closely at how Yeshua himself must complete his part in the next stage of Revelation to bring it to its finality, where, in chapter 17, verse 17, Yochanan says, "For God put it into their hearts to do what will fulfill his purpose, that is, to be of one mind, to give their kingdom to the beast, until God's words have been accomplished." However, before the 10 kings can be brought together to carry out God's intentions, we as Talmudim of Yeshua must be taken out of this current scene. Only then can the 10 kings fulfill their role and turn their collective attention towards Jerusalem, as we will see next Shabbat. But until then, Shabbat Shalom. I hope you haven't got a headache.